Among the inner circle of 12, one name stands apart, not for sanctity, but for infamy.
While others would run or deny, Judas chose a darker path in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Hail, Rabbi!
A gesture of friendship weaponized into an act of identification for the authorities. Why identify him with a kiss?
The price of a life, a transaction that has echoed through 2 millennia of history.
Just for 30 pieces of silver?
The other disciples faced their own moments of failure, fear, and denial before the end.
But was this treachery, or was it the fulfillment of a divine cosmic blueprint?
If Jesus had to die for the sins of the world, someone had to facilitate that death.
Some ask a disturbing question. Was Judas actually doing exactly what Jesus asked him to do? Doing what Jesus told him to do?
To answer this, we must look to the books that tell his story, the Gospels of the New Testament. What do the Gospels inside the New Testament tell us?
And then there are the whispered secrets found outside the canon, like the Gospel of Judas. And what does the Gospel of Judas tell us about all this? To judge Judas, we must first judge the witnesses who wrote these accounts.
It is first necessary to understand the Gospels themselves.
These texts were not written in a vacuum, but for churches in the late 1st century, products of their own time, serving the purposes of churches. They were never intended to be dry, objective history books as we understand them today. They were not primarily historical records.
They were declarations of faith, designed to proclaim the good news to a waiting world.
The authors were evangelists, shaping their narratives as with a specific goal in mind: conversion.
They took the raw memories and oral traditions and molded them to fit their message. The evangelists worked hard to formulate the traditions.
We view Judas only through this carefully constructed theological lens, since most of what we know about Judas is found in these Gospels.
To find the man, we must peel back 50 years of theological development, move back behind them half a century to talk about the historical Judas.
Jesus' own public ministry was largely confined to Jews.
Jesus and his followers were not Christians. They were Jews living in the land of Israel. And his disciples were Jews.
Even the explosive birth of the church at Pentecost was a strictly Jewish affair. They had not gathered to start a new religion, but to celebrate their ancient heritage, gathered in Jerusalem to celebrate a Jewish festival. Judas Iscariot emerged from this deep, rich soil of Second Temple Judaism, and Judas was a part of this very Jewish context.
It was out of this specific cultural and religious framework that the new faith would grow, out of which Christianity was born.
Judaism in the 1st century was a powerful force, respected even by those on the outside.
Non-Jews or Gentiles watched from the margins, drawn to its moral clarity, appealing not only to Jews but also to Gentiles. In a Roman world of excess and cruelty, Jewish ethics offered a refreshing purity. They admired the high ethical standards of the Jewish community.
The synagogue offered a sophisticated form of worship, devoid of the bloody rituals common elsewhere.
Animal sacrifice was restricted solely to the great temple in Jerusalem, far away from the diaspora, confined to the temple in Jerusalem.
Instead of smoke, there was scripture. Instead of blood, there was interpretation.
With an edifying, uplifting reading from their holy scriptures.
The Hebrew texts were read, then translated into the language of the streets for all to understand.
These assemblies, or synagogues, became hubs of community life throughout the empire.
Gentiles liked to attend these services in Jewish synagogues.
Yet, despite their attendance, most Gentiles stopped at the threshold, but few of them were actually willing to convert to Judaism. To become a full Jew, a proselyte, required a physical price few grown men were willing to pay. It also meant accepting a life of strict separation and dietary laws, accepting strict conformity to the Jewish lifestyle.
Converting meant cutting ties with the social fabric of the Roman world. Judaism meant abstaining from much of the desirable social life.
So they found a middle ground: attend on the Sabbath, live as Romans during the week. They preferred to attend the synagogue on the Sabbath, but live their normal lives.
These sympathetic outsiders were given a specific name:
God-fearers. These Gentiles who attended the...
It was precisely this group that became the fertile soil for Paul's revolutionary message. In the Jewish synagogues where Paul preached,
Paul offered them the best of both worlds, the ethics of Judaism without the ethnic restrictions. He offered them precisely what they wanted from Judaism.
A high ethical ideal without animal sacrifice.
No longer would they need to sever ties with their neighbors to serve the one true God, or outdated restrictions on their social relations. The painful knife was replaced by the cleansing water. Baptism was much better than circumcision.
This accessible version of the faith caused an explosion in numbers.
And so the Gentile Christian church blossomed.
The daughter church soon outgrew the mother church in Galilee, far surpassing in numbers what was left of Jesus' disciples in Galilee.
the original Jewish Christian community began to fade into obscurity. The withering Jewish Christian church.
The mission to the Gentiles was spearheaded by Barnabas and his recruit, Paul of Tarsus. Barnabas had enlisted for...
Paul was unique, a Pharisee, yet born and raised in the Gentile metropolis of Tarsus, from Tarsus on the southern coast of modern Turkey.
He understood the law of Moses, but he also understood the mind of the Greek, a Jew raised out there in the Gentile world.
Paul and Barnabas took Titus, a Gentile convert to Christianity, with them to Jerusalem,
to convince the pillars of the Jewish Christian church there that this Gentile should be recognized.
The question was fundamental. Could one be a Christian without first becoming a Jew?
Though uncircumcised, should be recognized as a fully accredited...
Finally, the leadership of Jerusalem conceded the point, recognizing the Spirit's work in the Gentiles.
The Jerusalem church conceded the point.
A diplomatic partition of the known world was established to keep the peace.
Reached a working arrangement with Paul and Barnabas.
The original disciples would focus on the circumcised, Paul would go to the uncircumcised.
The original disciples would continue their mission limited to Jews.
The deal was sealed with a gesture of brotherhood that bridged the divide, but gave the right hand of fellowship to Paul and Barnabas.
As a place, there was one condition. The Gentile churches must remember the poor of Jerusalem.
Paul, in turn, agreed to...
But theories agreed upon in Jerusalem faced a harsh test in the streets of Antioch. This fine ecumenical solution...
In Antioch, Jewish and Gentile believers did the unthinkable. They ate together. Paul and Barnabas had in practice the central act of Christian worship, the Eucharist, could not be segregated by race. The Lord's Supper could not be segregated. To maintain unity, the Jewish laws of ceremonial purity were quietly set aside. To retain their ceremonial purity, instead they ate together.
Even Peter, there for a visit from Jerusalem, went along with this tolerant Christian practice.
But the leadership in Jerusalem, now under Jesus' brother James, was watching.
Delegates from James arrived in Antioch with a hardline directive.
Sent delegates to Antioch to insist that Jewish Christians should eat only at a table with Jews.
Their message was clear. Purity matters more than unity.
To retain their ceremonial purity, even if the congregation included Gentiles.
Under pressure, Peter, the leader who had once walked on water, began to sink in fear. So
Peter's authority caused a chain reaction of segregation, and even Barnabas went along with this segregation.
Even Barnabas, Paul's partner in the Gentile mission, capitulated to the pressure from Jerusalem. Even Barnabas went along with this segregation.
Only one man stood his ground against the tide of reverting to the law. But Paul stood his ground.
Paul confronted Peter to his face, exposing the hypocrisy of the separation.
Denouncing this reliance on Jews.
This was not just about food, it was about the very nature of conditions for salvation.
Paul realized he could no longer work with the compromised Church of Antioch,
without the support of the Church of Antioch or of Jewish Christianity.
From that dinner table argument, a chasm opened that would never close.
The spirit of compromise from the Jerusalem Council evaporated. The ecumenicity of the Jerusalem Council gave way.
Demographics were on Paul's side, and the Gentile church grew wealthy and numerous. dominance of the more.
The powerful Gentile church eventually turned its back on its Jewish parents,
which returned the favor by rejecting the small Jewish Christian church.
What was once the original orthodoxy became branded as dangerous heresy, rejecting the small Jewish Christian church as heretical.
By the 4th century, Epiphanius, bishop of Salamis on Cyprus, wrote against the Jewish Christians.
He categorized the remnants of Jesus' family and original followers into sects, calling them heretical sects of Ebionites and Nazarenes.
The names were actually badges of honor. Ebionites meant the poor. The first term means the poor.
Nazarenes simply meant those from Nazareth, the home of their master. The second, from Nazareth.
The irony was tragic. The heretics were the ones living most like the founder. All these Jewish Christians were doing.
They strove to be both children of Israel and followers of the Messiah, while being Christians as well.
Looking back, the judgment of history seems harsh and misplaced. Surely, we would not call them heretics today.
This conflict between Jew and Gentile is the backdrop for understanding Judas.
As the church turned against the Jews, the portrait of Judas darkened.
The presentation of Judas in the Gospels.
In the earliest gospel, Mark, the details are sparse, the betrayal mysterious. It is
The evangelists worked hard to formulate the traditions.
Satan entered into Judas.
John, the latest gospel, paints Judas as a thief who never cared for the poor. He was a thief.
Judas became the scapegoat for a church distancing itself from Judaism, serving the purposes of churches in the last third of the 1st century.
As Judas gets worse, Pilate, the Roman governor, gets better in the texts.
They were written for evangelizing rather than simply to inform.
It was safe for the early church to blame a Jew than to blame the Roman Empire.
Convey the evangelizing point they had in mind.
But the rediscovered Gospel of Judas tells a radically different story.
The Gospel of Judas outside the New Testament.
Here, Judas is not the villain, but the only disciple who truly understands.
Identify Jesus, doing what Jesus told him to do.
Implementing the plan of God.
So who was the real Judas? The greedy traitor or the obedient friend? Is Judas just fulfilling biblical prophecy? The historical man is lost in the fog of theology and polemic. Move back behind them half a century to talk about the historical Judas.
Judas serves as a mirror for the believers telling his story.
Christian witnesses to Jesus.
Whether villain or victim, his kiss remains the pivot point of history.
To understand the tragedy, we must remember his status. He was not an outsider, but a member of the inner sanctum. He endured the same hardships, the same dust, and the same danger as the rest of them. Stuck with him through thick and thin to the bitter end.
Yet history judges his failure differently than the failures of his peers. Until it became time.
When the soldiers came, cowardice was the common reaction, not the exception. And run for life back to Galilee.
But Judas did not run. He stepped forward, crossing a line from which there was no return.
The method of betrayal remains the most intimate and chilling detail of the Passion. Why else does he identify Jesus to the Jewish authorities with a kiss?
The amount, 30 pieces of silver, echoes ancient prophecy more than current market value.
Just for 30 pieces of silver?
Was this amount a historical fact or a literary device to prove Jesus was the Messiah? Is Judas just fulfilling biblical prophecy?
If the death of Jesus was necessary for salvation, then Judas was the necessary instrument.
Some traditions even suggest secret command, a terrible burden placed on trust on the We must remember, the men who wrote these stories were not journalists. The evangelists worked hard to formulate the traditions.
They filtered the raw history through the prism of their evangelistic goals.
To please a Roman audience, the blame was shifted from the Roman executioners to the Jewish betrayer. They were not primarily historical records.
The Jewish context of Jesus and Judas was eroded by time and prejudice, and Judas was a part of this very Jewish context.
Synagogues where the early movement started were forgotten by the later church, out of which Christianity was born.
The Gentile world had admired the ethics of Judaism, even if they rejected the rituals.
Paul simply removed the barrier, opening the floodgates. He offered them precisely what they wanted. Baptism was much better than circumcision.
The influx of Gentiles overwhelmed the original Jewish core of the movement, far surpassing in numbers what was left of Jesus' disciples.
Jerusalem ceased to be the center. Power moved to Antioch, then Rome. The dominance of the more numerous and prosperous Gentile Christian church.
The Gentile church, the child, grew to despise its Jewish parent, returned the favor by rejecting the small Jewish Christian church.
The humble Ebionites were mocked for the very poverty Jesus praised, calling them heretical sects of Ebionites. The first term means the poor.
The Nazarenes held to the name of their town, while the world moved on to the name Christians.
What was heresy? Simply eating and living as Jesus himself had lived. All these Jewish Christians were doing what?
In this anti-Jewish climate, Judas became a caricature of the people the church rejected.
But the sand of Egypt hid a different story for nearly 2,000 years. What does the Gospel of Judas outside the New Testament tell us?
This text presents a Judas who is not a traitor, but a hero of knowledge.
Tell us about all this? It claims Jesus shared secrets with Judas that the other 12 could not handle.
Implementing the plan? Doing what Jesus told him to do?
In this view, killing the body of...
Yet, this too is a theology, not a history. The real man remains elusive.
We are let with the raw human fact. A friend turned against a friend. Betray him.
Perhaps Judas was a revolutionary who felt Jesus was moving too slowly.
Is Judas just fulfilling biblical prophecy?
Did he hand Jesus over to force him to reveal his power and destroy Rome?
Implementing the plan of God.
When the plan led to a cross instead of a crown, the weight was too much to bear. To the bitter end.
Judas is the shadow that haunts the history of the church.
Christian witnesses to Jesus.
The Jewish Christians he came from were silenced, but their questions remain.
Surely, we would not call them heretics today.
Every generation writes the Judas it needs, and the Jesus it wants. Products of their own time.
The Gospels give us the theology. The silence gives us the mystery. They were not primarily historical records.
The separation of the church from its Jewish roots began with a kiss and ended with a wall.
Today, we try to see Judas and the early Jewish believers not as monsters, but as tragic figures. We would not call them heretics today.
The story reminds us that faith has a cost, sometimes paid in silver, sometimes in blood.
Whether by divine plan or human failing, the prophecy was fulfilled. Fulfilling biblical prophecy.
Judas Iscariot, the disciple who made the cross possible.
Implementing the plan of God.
Was he the ultimate villain or the ultimate victim? One of the 12 apostles.
The night of betrayal ends, and the dawn of a new religion begins, before the cock crew twice.
The circle was broken, only to be rebuilt by others, leaving his seat forever empty. In the end, he was a man caught in the collision of heaven and earth, the historical Judas himself. And like the 30 pieces of silver, his story was cast into the treasury of history.
In the turbulent wake of the Apostle Paul's ministry, the memory of Jesus began to crystallize into two distinct communities began to collect their treasured recollections, shaping the legacy of the Nazarene according to their own needs.
The Jewish Christians focused on the wisdom and words of their teacher,
compiling what we now call the Sayings Gospel Q.
One main reason the Sayings Gospel Q never became a standalone book in the New Testament is purely political.
The New Testament is ultimately the book of the Gentile Christian church, not the Jewish Christian church.
We only know about the Sayings Gospel Q because of a final, desperate act of unity between the two confessions.
Both confessions decided to merge the Sayings Gospel Q and the narrative Gospel Mark into a single gospel, each from their own perspective.
Luke undertook the same task, but crafted his merger from the perspective of the Gentile Christian church.
Through this merging, it is possible for modern scholars to reconstruct the Sayings Gospel Q rather accurately.
Though reconstructed, no physical manuscripts of Q have survived, for a simple, pragmatic reason. It ceased to be copied by the Gentile Christian church, which had no need for a sayings list once the narratives were formed. Significantly, the Sayings Gospel Q made no reference at all to Judas Iscariot.
It was the narrative Gospel Mark that presented the familiar, dark picture of Judas.
Mark established the image of Judas leading the Jewish authorities to the Garden of Gethsemane to arrest Jesus.
But it is precisely this familiar story that needs to be re-examined in the context of new discoveries.
The emergence of the Gospel of Judas has forced a re-evaluation of this ancient villain. Before this discovery, distinguished Mennonite scholar William Klassen had already questioned the narrative.
Klassen's work undertook just such a re-examination, asking if Judas was truly a villain.
To understand the Gospel of Judas correctly, we must first familiarize ourselves with the New Testament Gospels themselves.
It is from these texts that our understandably hostile feelings about Judas are derived.
We begin our investigation with the first Gentile Christian gospel, the Gospel of Mark.
Mark presents the inner circle of Jesus' disciples in a surprisingly harsh light.
What does he mean? I don't understand.
He says the last shall be first.
They are depicted as being very ignorant about Jesus, as to who he was and what he was trying to do.
You really have to wonder why they followed him at all, or why Mark portrayed them that way.
Let's see how he did portray them, and try to figure out the reason behind this literary choice.
After telling the parable of the sower, which even a child could understand, Jesus addresses his disciples.
Do you not understand this parable? Then how will you understand all the parables?
He did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples.
Yet, despite this private tutoring, the disciples seem still in the dark. They still don't seem to understand who Jesus was.
Later, when the disciples in the boat see Jesus walking on the water toward them,
They all saw him and were all terrified, thinking he was a ghost.
But immediately he spoke. Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid.
They were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves. But their hearts were hardened.
Jesus asks, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand?"
Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see?
And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? They said to him, 12.
12, 12, 12.
And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect?
7.
It is not surprising that Jesus knows just how unreliable the inner circle is.
How many of this inner circle of the 12 does Mark portray as being with him at the end, at the foot of the cross? None.
Jesus knew quite well that none would die with him, but that they would do a quick retreat to Galilee.
The narrative confirms this flight, as the young man at the empty tomb instructs the women.
Note that Peter is singled out specifically, perhaps implying he had fallen even further than the rest.
To understand this fracture, we must return to the Garden of Gethsemane, where the inner circle had been out of it completely.
Jesus had asked them for support, but he came and found them sleeping.
He said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial."
The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak.
And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And once more he came and found them sleeping.
He came a third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Get up, let us be going. See, the one giving me over is at hand." With this, the anti-hero Judas walks across the stage.
He signals the arrest with a kiss, the traditional sign of friendship turned weapon.
But as our survey of Mark's presentation of the inner circle indicates, none of them are really much better in Mark's presentation than Judas.
Some have thought that such a scoundrel as Judas could not possibly have been chosen by Jesus as one of the 12.
But, from Mark's point of view, he would have fitted right in with the innermost circle. At least Peter should be presented favorably, since after all it is he who is the rock on which the church is built.
But not in Mark. That is Matthew's effort to clean up Peter's act.
In Mark, Peter's confession to Jesus at Caesarea Philippi,
"You are the Messiah,"
takes a startlingly different turn. "You are the Messiah."
Messiah.
But then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering. The Son of Man must be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed.
But how can this be? We cannot let this happen to you, Lord.
And after 3 days rise again. I must be killed, but on the 3rd day I will rise again. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected and be killed.
He said all this quite openly.
And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "This must not happen to you, Lord. We won't let it." Peter cannot accept a suffering Messiah. It contradicts his triumph narrative.
Never. Impossible.
But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter.
Get behind me, Satan. You are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. He said, "Get behind me, Satan." Get behind me, Satan.
Jesus calls his chief disciple Satan, the adversary.
For you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things.
In Mark's gospel, Peter is not the rock of the church, but the stumbling block of Satan. Unlike Matthew, Mark does not follow this with a reinstatement of Peter.
This incident epitomizes the state of the disciples in this gospel, well-meaning, but spiritually blind.
Our hostility toward Judas is derived from these texts, but the texts themselves are harder on the others than we remember.
This realization paves the way for an emerging, more tolerant attitude toward Judas.
If the canonical Mark is this harsh on the faithful, What might an alternative gospel say about the betrayer?
Did Judas act alone? Or was he, like Peter, playing a role he did not understand?
Or perhaps, unlike Peter, who opposed the suffering, Judas was the only one who facilitated it?
Let us look at that kiss in Gethsemane one more time.
Jesus does not stop him.
Let the scriptures be fulfilled.
Mark adds a bizarre detail. A young man following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth, is seized and flees naked.
This strange figure symbolizes the total shame and exposure of the disciples' abandonment.
While the others fled in shame, Judas at least completed his task, however terrible.
Mark leaves us with a Messiah abandoned by all, betrayed by one, and denied by his leader. This bleak picture sets the stage for a radical reimagining found in the sands of Egypt.
The Gospel of Judas tells a story where the betrayal is not a failure, but a secret success.
What if the one Mark called a traitor was actually the only one who understood?
To understand this, we must open the codex that was hidden for nearly 2 millennia.
The rediscovery of this text was not immediate. It languished in obscurity, crumbling in a safety deposit box before reaching scholars.
Yet, even before the ink of this ancient codex was translated, the re-examination of Judas had already begun in the modern mind. A distinguished Mennonite scholar, William Klassen, dared to ask the forbidden question in his 1996 book. Klassen scrutinized the Greek word commonly translated as betray, paradidomi. The word simply means to hand over or to deliver, a neutral term used elsewhere for divine actions.
If Jesus had to die for the salvation of the world, was the one who handed him over a villain or an instrument of God?
This possibility brings us back to the earliest layer of tradition, the Jewish Christian sayings Gospel Q.
As we noted, Q made no reference to Judas. In the earliest Jewish recollections, the betrayal was not the defining story.
It was the Gentile church, through Mark, that needed a narrative explanation for the crucifixion.
By casting Judas, whose name literally means Jew, as the villain, the Gentile texts shifted blame away from Rome.
Judas became the anti-hero who walked across the stage to absolve the Roman authorities.
But as we have seen, Mark's hostility was not reserved for Judas alone. It was a fire that scorched the entire inner circle. The argument that a scoundrel like Judas couldn't be chosen by Jesus falls apart when we see who else was chosen. From Mark's point of view, Judas fitted right in, because the 12 were defined by their lack of understanding. If Peter, the rock, could be called Satan, then Judas, the betrayer, might be something more complex.
The Gentile Christian church needed a scapegoat to distance itself from the Jewish rebellion and the Jewish Messiah's death.
But we must remember the moment of ecumenism, when Q and Mark were merged.
Matthew, writing from the Jewish Christian perspective, tried to rehabilitate Peter, the Jewish leader. Luke, from the Gentile perspective, smoothed over the harshness of Mark. Yet, neither Matthew nor Luke saved Judas. He remained the necessary villain for the emerging orthodoxy.
It was only outside the canon, in the Gnostic sects, that the re-examination could fully take root. If the Gospel of Judas is to be correctly understood, we must shed the bias ingrained by Mark.
Our quite understandably hostile feelings are a product of a specific literary strategy, not necessarily historical fact.
The emerging, more tolerant attitude mentioned in the text is the result of recognizing these literary devices.
The Gospel of Judas does not just offer a different story. It challenges the very definition of discipleship found in the New Testament. If they were all ignorant, why was only one condemned? The answer lies in the politics of the early church. The story of the betrayer survived because it was useful, and the story of the friend was buried in the sands.
But the sands have now given up their secret.
We can now read the familiar story of Gethsemane through a new lens.
We began with the first Gentile Christian gospel, Mark, because it laid the foundation for the hostility.
To understand the historical Jesus and his relationship with Judas, we must dismantle this fortress stone by stone.
The mystery of the 12 is not their holiness, but their humanity and confusion.
In Mark, Peter plays the role of Satan. In the new gospel, does Judas play the role of the Savior's confidant?
The sayings gospel Q was the last expression of a church that didn't need a betrayal narrative.
The narrative gospel Mark became the dominant voice, drowning out the silence of Q.
Now, we reclaim that silence and fill it with the voice of the gospel of Judas. Was Judas the worst of them, or the best of them? The only one who understood the mission? To answer this, we must step fully out of the New Testament and into the forbidden library. History is written by the victors, but the losers sometimes leave a note.
The team of scholars who reconstructed Q also paved the way for analyzing these new texts. Only by holding Mark, Q, and Judas together can we see the full spectrum of early Christianity. The re-examination calls for us to suspend our judgment and listen to the betrayer.
We have seen how the Gentile church constructed the villain. Now we must see how a different community constructed the hero.
This is the invitation of the Codex Chakos, to know what Jesus taught Judas in private.
The shadow over Gethsemane lifts, revealing a different kind of garden.
Beyond betrayal, beyond friendship, there is gnosis, knowledge.
And in this knowledge, the man we thought we knew becomes a stranger once again.
Join us as we read the Forbidden Gospel.